Hello everybody and welcome to TheKabooblesProject. I'm your host Cora. Thank you so very much for joining me as we have another crack at a bit of a sculpt together. We do so much love sculpting and we very much love to have you here joining us on our little journey together. This sculpt I think takes about 8.5 hours in total. We're gonna bring that down to about 9 hours. To about 9 hours, yeah. We're gonna be here for 9 straight hours. Longer than the original sculpt, in fact. For about 10 minutes, we're gonna time lapse this down to. I'm gonna talk us through it. Through the process. There's a little bit of a tutorial on what we do and how we sculpt these things. The big lessons today are going to be the use of the displacement modifier and the use of the lattice modifier for creating kind of objects that can move around and can be shaped using sort of unique methods. We use both of those today because they're fun and they're really good ways to save time and they create some really beautiful effects. So we're going to have fun talking about those. Before we get to it though, we've got to start with the face. Once again, do we ever do anything differently? The face is where all of the interest goes, so we start there. And here we're going to be sculpting a sort of elderly lady, an elderly kind of druid faun who's created or sort of summoned this little pixie into her hand and is sort of amazed at what she's seeing. So she's got a sort of wisdom of age and an expression that's quite youthful and fascinated and cool. Just awesome. And I just want it to be awesome. She is going to be, I don't know what that was. I just enjoy it. We're going to focus on the face pretty heavily. Open mouths can be pretty tricky on any face, just because getting the jawline right for an open mouth can be quite challenging. But I think this one works out pretty well, mostly just because I think honestly because she's a bit older. It's slightly easier to sculpt slightly older faces just because they have this sort of higher level of detail and they're slightly more forgiving in the way that they're formed. So yeah, just slightly easier. I think young female faces are exceptionally difficult to sculpt perfectly because you can't really add a lot of geometry without either aging the face or masculinizing the face, which in some cases is completely reasonable. I mean, lots of women have more masculine faces. I'm one of them, I suppose. For those who don't know, I'm a transgender woman. Yeah, so it can do that, but for older faces, you've got a bit more to play with. Effectively, you can get away with a bit more stuff without it looking unusual. Yet it can always fall into the uncanny valley, and down there be dragons. So using really good reference material, like the eyes from this particular woman that's been photographed, or a woman that with consent you have photographed the eyes of, or like the cheekbones of this particular woman, and you find the really good reference material often online in order to let you know where the shapes should be, because it's very difficult to do that purely from imagination. You sort of need lots of different pieces of reference material to work from. Next step is, of course, our little pixie, and the pixie is a very challenging piece to sculpt, largely because it's so small. The issue isn't with the sculpt itself or with the rendering, it's easy enough, but the 3D printing of it can be very, very challenging, mostly because if she's too thin, it just won't print. Like, it'll just fail at that point, and that's the last thing we want. Can't do anything with a failed print. So what we do is we use a bunch of methods to make her basically just a bit thicker, effectively, so make the pieces less sort of prone to failure. We give her big wings, we make the wings quite thick, which I think works fairly well. We bring her arms back so they're kind of connected to the wings. We use a skirt around the legs to make sure that there's just one big piece down there instead of these very thin legs. And finally, we use hair. We bring the hair down, sweeping around the figure and around the finger in order to kind of just effectively thicken the piece as a whole and make sure that it'll print. It's also pretty. I just like pretty hair. Well, what more do you want from me? Eventually we actually have to move her because it still just looks too thin to me. I'm still nervous, so I bring her down into the palm of the hand, and that looks a lot better because she's just connected to more geometry, and it looks like it's going to like there's a finger up her back and resting against like the hair on her back, which I think means that it even thickens the sculpt more, so it should print okay. We'll have a crack at it later and hopefully it'll print. hair time. We make a braid, first of all, which isn't as difficult as you might think, and then we use the lattice modifier, connect the braid to the lattice, and then shape the lattice into place. So even though the braid is one long straight piece, the lattice shapes it against the head and the back, and it's really works really well. And then we boolean the piece to the hair, and then we use dynamic topology to sculpt the whole thing into one piece so it looks like a French braid. If you're interested how to do that, please don't hesitate to whack a comment in the comments down below. I will for sure give you a tutorial anytime. More than happy to kind of show you how we do that in some detail. Now once that's done, it's horns time, and these are purely generated. So what we do is we create the first piece, use an array modifier to duplicate it up, use a curve modifier in order to shape it into place, and then we use the displacement modifier, in fact multiple displacement modifiers, to create the texture. And that I think works really, really well. It's the first time I tried to use the displacement modifier to create texture like this. I really, really like it. I think the effect is lovely. And then we just kind of, do a bit of sculpting to make sure that the whole thing fits together, like the horns are actually embedded into her skin and they feel like a piece of her, basically. So that's the first time that we do that. We then do basically the same thing again for this cloak. So we're going to sculpt a cloak into place using hard surface sculpting, which is basically just using box modeling. And then we add a displacement modifier to thicken the piece up. Actually, I think we use a solidify modifier to thicken the piece up, and then we use a displacement modifier to create the texture. Which basically we use generate a cloud texture and just kind of really use a very low strength, just to give it a little bit of detail, just to make it look nice, And then we're sculpting for 3D printing and painting, so a little bit of texture can also help to pick up some of those details in the painting process if you can use a wash or dry brushing or something. Yeah, for sure. And then in order to kind of match those levels of detail in the horns and the cloak in particular and the hair, we're going to add a lot of detail to the face. Just continue to add in wrinkles and just little elements that might be picked up in the painting that I think is really, really nice. Just going to continue to sort of try and add realistic texture and details to the face. And then I have to go away and look for some reference material to see what older hands look like, so that I can sculpt the hands in the same way, because they started to look a bit sort of comparably youthful. Nothing wrong with youthful hands, but I think it's more realistic that she would have some slightly older hands. So we add in some vascularization, add in some wrinkles, add in our nails, just to make it all look a bit more like it fits in together. Pop the young Pixi into her palm of her hand so that she's more sort of robustly connected, and then we add in some sleeves and stuff. Last piece of the puzzle, of course, is going to be her clothes. And we decide to add in a bit of a bodice, and the reason that we do this, I mean, it might seem unusual in a character like this, but what I really want is to add another level of texture to the bodice piece. I know that her clothes are going to need texture, so I want a kind of form of the clothes to have these big, broad, flat forms that are going to carry a texture really well, because what I want to do is use dynamic topology and use a vector texture to apply a sort of like a leaf texture to the whole bodice, like at least all the pieces that should have texture to them. So not the sort of not the lining at the edges, but the actual piece itself needs that texture. So we go in, use a draw brush at an extremely high level of detail dynamic topology. It slows the computer right down, and we apply a kind of a generated leaf texture to the whole thing. It really ups the resolution of this image of the MIDI. The amount of geometry is like millions and millions of faces. It slows things right down. So use a decimate modifier just to bring that back down and make it a bit more manageable. And then the sides don't look right because, of course, when you're using a texture like that, wherever you're applying the texture to the sides of an object where the camera isn't circled around it, then it sort of smears the texture a bit. So we add in some detail just to cover that up and add in a little bit extra visual interest. Finally, a bit of a necklace and then a boolean, just to bring everything together into a single mesh. And to smooth over the edges. And there we are. Basically the finished product here of Pixi and her little fairy. If you'd like to download this sculpt, you absolutely can do that on my mini factory under the Kaboobles project. There's a link in the description down below. Please like and subscribe because it really helps the YouTube algorithm to send our videos to more and more people. And please do also comment if you'd like to see a particular sculpt. We so love being part of this community. You are very welcome here, and we would love to hear what you think. And if you have any ideas for new sculpts, we'd love to sculpt them for you. So please whap them in the comments down below. Thanks very much. We look forward to seeing you next time.